Welcome, everybody. We're going to show you all some photos, some work that Andrew and I have been, that we've made over the past couple years. My name is Grace Beam Alford, and I've been fortunate enough to be a photojournalist at the Post and Courier for 22 years. I wanted to thank you all tonight, and we are going to show you these pictures, which they're my photos and Andrew's photos, and let you know that these photos are generated from daily assignments. They're from long-term projects, short-term projects, and they also come from self-generated story ideas. I'm a big believer in letting the images speak for themselves as we attempt to translate the chaos of life into a moment that is preserved, a moment of history, captured. An image has the power to inform, to educate, to evoke emotions, and to create change. A statue that took 23 hours to come down finally did. We were there for that, Andrew and I, both awake many hours. I often say that I have had the privilege to witness everything in life through my camera, from birth to death. Within that comes the honor of making images that show images to be there for moments like this, where forgiveness was granted to a murderer 2 days after killings in a church. He was shown grace that set the tone for a nation to grieve these killings. This is days we had 2 funerals from that Emmanuel Church in one day. I've seen homeless children housed. I've seen domestic violence survivors freed by telling their stories. These are only some of the stories that I have had the privilege of working on all my years in the Post and Courier. As a photojournalist, we want to bring you to places where you haven't been. We want you to be a part of the moment and make you feel how it was to be there. The ability to communicate through images, sharing parts of the world you've never experienced before. We are fortunate enough to have one of the largest visual staffs in the Southeast, and who in the last few years have traveled the globe to share images from Antarctica, Senegal, and Mexico. This year, the world was watching us as all eyes turned to the town of Walterboro for the trial of Alec Murdaugh. Andrew and I were part of the pool, meaning we were the only photographers allowed in the courtroom. So if you saw still images from the trial, they were made by us. I had been a pool photographer before in front of Judge Newman, and so I felt that I could prepare us to set us up in 2 spots on either side of the courtroom. So photographing a trial for 6 weeks from only 2 spots and being able to make interesting images daily is a master class in human behavior, watching and observing body language for small details that tell the larger story, that make all the viewers who are watching feel and experience like they would be there.
Good evening, my name is Andrew Whitaker. The trial felt like the movie Groundhog's Day, but some days were different, like when someone called in a bomb threat and everybody had to evacuate. There was a sense of unknown, but I knew it was my job to document this newsy event. Near the end of the trial, 3 members of the media were allowed to go onto the property at Moselle. I was chosen along with a videographer and a reporter. This was very important to me as I was one of the first on the scene the morning after the murder in 2021. The day in 2023 felt quiet and eerie. I remember helping count how many steps away Paul was from his mother, Maggie, and then feeling emotional for something that happened 2 years ago. I will always remember that day. Later on, Alex was found guilty, and that moment flashed 6 weeks later. It finally come to an end. A little over a month after the trial, I had the opportunity of a lifetime to go with a reporter to Senegal. Kind of like this fundraiser tonight, we were able to go with the help of the Pulitzer Center. But why were we there? Why does Charleston or South Carolina care about what's going around across the Atlantic Ocean from a local newspaper? A professor from San Luis had said to us, countries may have borders, but the climate does not. The reporter Tony Bartlemy had the idea to further understand dust from the Sahara Desert and its impact on hurricanes over here. But how the heck do you photograph dust? I wanted to give the viewer the feeling like they were right there with me as I photographed sites that made you feel like you're walking in the desert or hearing the busy streets of Dakar. I felt like documenting moments we saw allowed the story to grow where written text just couldn't reach. The most memorable moments were ones where I wasn't allowed to make photographs. I had to be cautious with my camera, and we spent most of our time in Senegal, but also went to Mauritania, where photography isn't quite as accepted. I basically had to smuggle my camera into the country and cross the Senegal River and spend hours at customs. I knew if they saw it, they would take it, but they never searched my bag. We finally were able to enter the country, made a stop in a village, and we talked with some locals. The family took us in to have tea. Though I wasn't allowed to photograph in their home, this moment was priceless. The last group of images I'll show you are very important to me. They aren't as newsy as climate change or a large-scale trial, but highlights the journalist part of photojournalism. For a while, we had this idea to document something for 24 hours. And I thought, why not Folly Beach? This year happened to be the town's 50th anniversary, so I wanted to make it happen. My idea was, no matter what time of day or night, there's a story to be told. There's a moment happening, whether it is at a crowded beach at noon or a sleepy clerk working the third shift at Burt's Market. The entire staff helped work on this project as we split up the 24 hours in shifts, except for myself, where I photographed nonstop from noon Saturday to noon Sunday on a weekend in August. Besides still images, we recorded video moments that went along with the story. I wanted to give the experience for those reading and looking at this visual narrative, to hear the sounds at 2 a.m. and feel the wind along the beach as they continue to scroll on our website. Being a photojournalist at a newspaper allows us to be creative in how to tell stories, whether they are a standalone visual narrative or accompanied by a writer's words. It is truly incredible that our camera is the key to these intimate moments that most people do not get to experience. Photographers get to open these doors for all of you to feel and see these stories of life and death. That being said, I wanted to thank you for being here.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us as we celebrate preserving community journalism. If I haven't had the chance to meet you yet, I'm PJ Browning, and I'm the president publisher of the Post and Courier and CEO of Evening Post Publishing. And I will tell you, I have been doing this, it'll be 40 years on January 3rd. So it's certainly been a life mission and something I've enjoyed. So. I get to talk about the business side, and the reason I'm in this business and on the business side is to be able to support the work that you've seen tonight, and it's some really compelling work, and we have a wonderful staff, so I hope you enjoyed that. As convenience and accessibility to the internet and social media has grown, it has had a profound impact on the financial stability of the newspaper industry. Across the United States, Medill reports that this year alone, 2.5 newspapers are disappearing per week. In the past, newspapers relied on advertising to support journalists and our overall operations. Our print subscription revenue only accounted for 1/3 of the revenues that came into the newspaper. So according to Pew Research, there's some good news here. The good news is that 20.9 million people read a weekday or Sunday version of a newspaper, which is only down between 8 and 9% from 2021. So what has flipped newspapers on their heads? It's really big tech and the internet. So today, Google and Facebook, they get 70 cents out of every dollar in ad revenue that used to go to newspapers. And we get it, right? Ordering on Amazon, it's not only easy, but it's convenient. Retailers don't have to use pre-printed inserts, that's advertising circulars that used to be inserted into the newspaper. That's what they used to use to draw you into their stores for that latest deal. And for several years, we've seen the decline in this revenue, and we've tried to manage literally the millions of dollars in loss that this represents. So the example that I like to share, and I think everybody can relate to, in the past, retailers relied on us as newspapers for Black Friday. Now, Black Friday lasts for a week, and it runs right into Cyber Monday deals that you can conveniently find all over the internet. A Thanksgiving Day paper used to weigh 3 pounds. This year, our Thanksgiving paper weighed a half a pound. Right, that 2.5 pounds was all advertising revenue that we lost. So you can see the impact. And while most of us might like to lose a little weight, the newspaper industry cannot afford to. For newspapers, this revenue's gone, and it's not coming back. So for us, we have to continue to work towards a sustainable business model that doesn't involve cutting journalists and creating another news desert in South Carolina. We were fortunate to have Ted Koppel from CBS Sunday Morning do a feature on us this past year that you may have seen. As he shared, the Post and Courier is a locally owned newspaper that is working creatively to sustain strong journalism and a winning business model in South Carolina. It has been a mission of passion, of determination, and mostly support from our readers and donors. As a part of our plan, and with your support, we have expanded digitally to 7 markets in South Carolina, where we now provide local news to communities where strong newspapers used to exist. With your support, you've heard tonight we've created an education lab which focuses on a better education for children in South Carolina, a Rising Waters lab, and a public service and investigative reporting fund. As we move forward, without question, we will need your support more than ever. Philanthropy will become more important to the sustainability and the survival of community journalism. We sincerely appreciate your support of the Post and Courier, and we want you to know how important you are to the health of this newspaper. Along with reporters, photographers, and editors producing compelling and important journalism, it takes a special group of people to produce the printed newspaper 365 days a year. Almost a year has passed since our final newspaper rolled off the presses at 134 Columbus Street. In the moments before bidding farewell to our historic location, we gathered past pressmen of the Post and Courier to reflect on their invaluable contributions. For decades, these individuals were the vanguards who witnessed the first rough draft of history as the ink hit our pages. Their recollections form the core of a documentary, a testament to our press's storied legacy and our seamless transition to a shared print and digital future. Our new press, located off Leeds Avenue, marks the dawn of this new era. Tonight, we're thrilled to offer a preview of a new documentary from the Post and Courier, which we plan to release early next year. Join us as we celebrate our legacy, honor the past, embrace the future, and recognize the tireless dedication of these skilled pressmen.
There's a lot of pride in being a pressman. They want that newspaper to hit the street. to look as good as they can possibly look, that they know that they're part of it. Simple as that. We are all pressmen. That's the unity we got right there. That's the bond we have together. It's a job that you probably went 5, maybe 10 years to know that you've earned that title.
I was waiting to be interviewed. The HR person said, "You don't want this job. It's nothing but grease and ink, and that's all it will ever be, is grease and ink."
Like an ink mist, a mist, and it'd get all over you.
So when you took your glasses off, you'd have white circles around your eyes because your face was black around it.
I used to tell new kids coming in and out the street, you might get inky, but the money's clean.
We saw each other a lot over the years, a lot.
You spent more time down here than you did with your wife.
I mean, this is your second home and this is your second family. Yeah, that's right. Plain and simple.
We didn't figure that out until the end. And we fought and worked and sweat and pushed each other around and loved each other, but we didn't know it.
You call everybody a few names.
We had ups and downs, but together, you know, the list of procedures we have on the wall, it didn't come from one or two of us. It came from all of us. And that's how we survived. I think we're all proud to be members of Post and Courier. They've continued the tradition. Now they've got a new press. It is different, but they continue. So we're all proud of that.
This is the first pour of our new facility out here at Leeds. We're putting in 560 ton of concrete, and steel and rebar. They had to dig it out and dig down 3 feet for the pad for the press to set on because the press itself weighs around 200,000 pounds.
Tonight we were printing our last edition off of this press before we moved to our new location. A press is like a human being. They're very finicky. They can be as swish as they want to be, and they can be as mean as they want to be. It just depends on the mood that is in that day. You know, some days she can run so smooth and there's no problem. Other days things can be so rough until you want to just scream. Today she ran fine. It's the end of a dynasty in this building. I didn't ever think I was going to work on another different press, but I'm looking forward to it.
You know, a big part of the book is talking about that ownership, and there's an anecdote where, you know, it's Ben Bradley's funeral, and at first he's not going to go. And then he's urged to go, and he does, and that it felt like that changed the way he saw his ownership or his stewardship of the Washington Post.
Yeah, it was a key moment for him. So Bezos acquired the Washington Post at the beginning of October of 2013. Ben Bradley died about a year later, a little over a year later, in October of 2014. And there, of course, was a big memorial service scheduled for the National Cathedral in Washington. Bezos wasn't planning to go because he never knew Ben Bradley. And then Bob Woodward got wind of that and sent him a note saying, by the way, Ben Bradley was the soul of the institution that you now own, and you should be there. And so he sent a note back saying, got it, I'll be there. And he, you know, if you have your own private plane, it's a little easier than taking commercial flights. He went immediately to Washington. He attended the memorial service. And it was a key moment for him because he said that it really gave him a sense of listening to people talk about Ben Bradley and his life and how he worked in the newsroom, gave him a sense of the culture of the Post in a way that he didn't really appreciate up till that point. He used a word, so I apologize for it, it's a little profane, that the newspaper was kind of badass. And by that he meant in a good way, which was that it was determined, it was driven, it was a little intimidating, all of that, which is sort of what Ben Bradlee was. And that was the culture of the place. And he asked me actually at the time, he said, I said that it was kind of, it's a calling. And he said, yeah, that's a good word. Would you say that that's unique to the Post? And I said, that's been the case at every newspaper I've ever worked at. And I'm sure that's true at the Post and Courier as well.
A big part of the book is talking about these big stories and the debates that happened and the decision-making that happened, the standards that you adhered to. And almost as soon as you got that job, you had to make or be part of the decision-making process around the Edward Snowden story. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure, why not? It's in the book. So, not hiding anything. So, it was a huge decision. I had just arrived at the Post, and relatively few months later, maybe 5 months later, Bart Gellman, who had been a reporter at the Post for a very long period of time, but was no longer working there, came to us and said that he had been in contact with somebody who had access to what turned out to be the most sensitive national security documents in the U.S. government. He had access to some at that point, but expected to get access to others. What they showed, as he described it to us, was a widespread surveillance regime, far more extensive than anybody could have imagined, and not one that was just spying on people overseas, but something that actually sucked up, vacuumed up a huge amount of information on a large number of American citizens, of course without their knowledge. And this is a program of surveillance that was continuing to expand and deepen, and he wanted to know if we were willing to publish that story. You know, when you publish national security documents, classified documents, and these were the most highly classified documents in the U.S. government, it's a hugely sensitive subject, and of course this came in the aftermath of 9/11. I had lived through 9/11. I was the editor of the Boston Globe when those attacks took place, 6 weeks actually after I arrived at the Boston Globe. The two planes that hit the World Trade Center flew out of Boston, and the father of one of our correspondents, our Moscow correspondent, was killed in one of those planes. So I was certainly highly sensitized to the implications for national security and, you know, concerned that we might do something that could assist terrorists. On the other hand, I was also concerned about government intruding into the privacy of American citizens. And so, you know, there's a tension there, and like what is the decision that needs to, I mean, you have to make a decision. Is this something that the American public should know? I thought a lot about it. I thought overnight, I mean, initially I said, yes, we would be willing to do that. And then overnight I was like, well, did I make the right call here? And there are a lot of risks, by the way, in addition to everything else. The risks for the nation, there are risks for the institution of the Washington Post, and for each individual who works there, who was working on that story, because people could be prosecuted and all of that, and there could be huge fines. And so, but I'm very wary of the power of government and particularly being in possession of people's private information and how that can be used or misused and abused. And I felt that ultimately that was a really important public policy issue, which was our standard for, is there really a public interest in this information? And so are we serving the public by publishing it? And the decision fell on me, and I made the decision that we should publish it, and we went ahead and did that. You know, there were people who totally disagree with that decision. There were people in government, particularly in the intelligence community, as well as in Congress, who felt that people like me should have been put in prison for that. But there were also people in Congress who thought that this information did need to be public. And by the way, it cut across both parties. So people like Rand Paul was very, you know, outraged by this, and other Republicans as well. And they wanted these programs scaled back considerably. And the tech companies were astonished at how much of their information was actually being pilfered by, essentially pilfered by the intelligence community. and they wanted it to stop as well. So these programs, obviously had to be modified in some way. We were very careful. We always talk to the intelligence agencies. We tell them what we plan to run. They have the opportunity to object, to raise concerns about specifics. And there were instances, of course, that we withheld some information, particularly if it was going to put an intelligence agent at risk, personal, physical risk, or put an intelligence facility at risk. And so that's the kind of information that we withheld. But in terms of the sort of overall thrust of the stories, we never withheld anything that sort of made the larger point.
One thing that surprised me watching you, I always think of objectivity as being something, a core value we all agree on. And watching you over the last few years be painted as, old-fashioned for believing in objectivity has surprised me. But you've stuck by your beliefs and doubled down, in fact. So is there something in your career, a formative moment, a mentor, that shaped your view of this profession?
Well, it's just how I grew up in the profession. I don't think of myself, I think of myself as maybe old, but not old-fashioned, by the way. So, but I think, look, I mean, those were the values in our profession for a long period of time. And I think it's important to define what objectivity is. It's not false equivalence and false balance and, both sidesism and on the one hand, other hand, journalism. This is a concept that goes back more than 100 years. Walter Lippmann sort of popularized it in his little book of essays called Liberty in the News. And the idea, and the reason he wrote that was because he was astonished at the impact of propaganda during the Wilson administration and that it led the U.S. into this slaughter of a war. And he felt the press had been taken in by this propaganda. So it was a reaction against propaganda, not an effort to disseminate propaganda or to excuse propaganda. And so his view was we need to approach our jobs more like scientists approach their jobs, is that yeah, we have our hypotheses, we have all have our opinions and our preconceptions and all of that, but ultimately we need to sort of move beyond that and take a look at the totality of the evidence and look at it, look at all the documents, talk to all the appropriate people, do research that was vigorous, rigorous, thorough, comprehensive, independent, all of that, and then when we've done the work and we've done it right, we tell people what we've actually found. And so that was just something that I grew up with in the profession, and which I saw produce a lot of incredibly powerful journalism. Whether it was the Watergate at the Washington Post, whether it was the Pentagon Papers that the New York Times first disclosed, or whether it was the Catholic Church cover-up investigation that we did at the Boston Globe. All of those were done with the idea of objectivity. When it came to investigating the Catholic Church, it didn't matter. I mean, totally irrelevant would be whether somebody had a bad experience in Catholic school, whether they had opinions about the church's views on abortion, whether they had opinions about the church's views on gay marriage, or whether they had, or alternatively, whether they felt particularly loyal to the church and they felt, okay, well, this is an institution that does a lot of good work in the community, which it does, so we need to ignore these other things. We need to protect the church. All of that was really irrelevant. It's like, no, the question here is the church aware of this abuse, serial abuse? Are they assigning these priests from one parish to the next where they then abuse again, so having the church enable their abuse, and are they then covering that? Are they covering it up, not telling the public about this abuse, and thus putting at risk children? And so that's the subject we were trying to pursue. And so, and all the other stuff, anybody's opinions about church policies on this or that, or their own personal experiences, is completely irrelevant to that. And so that is that's an objective approach, and it can produce, I believe, produces the most powerful journalism, and is the proper way for us to approach our jobs, where we begin with questions, not with answers. We go seeking the answers. We don't assume that we have the answers before we've done our reporting.
You say it, toward the end of the book, in this era of misinformation that newspapers, journalists need to double down on investigative journalism, not back away from it. You're, known for many things, but especially your work at the Boston Globe with the Spotlight team. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of resources that go into investigative work?
Yeah, well, as you heard, as you were going, here, when you heard about the projects and investigations that the Post and Courier does, it takes a lot of resources. You're very lucky, by the way, to have an independent, family-owned news organization here, and to and to have one that has a team of people who focus on doing what we like to call accountability work, is holding institutions and individuals accountable, and conducting investigations and doing it the right way with impact. And so, at these resources, you don't know when you start on, Thad mentioned this earlier, when you start on an investigation, you don't know that it's going to produce a result. It may turn out you start with a hypothesis or some indication that there might be wrongdoing, but if you do your work and there isn't any evidence, you have to drop it and move on. And you may have invested an enormous amount of time in that just to look at that. And then when you actually do see solid evidence of wrongdoing, the amount of work that's required simply to document that is tremendous. The number of people you have to interview, the documents you need to obtain, and as was mentioned earlier, just the expense of getting those documents. What's happening now is that a lot of government agencies, local government agencies, and others, statewide government agencies, have now decided, in a way to protect themselves, is to charge a lot of money, and while they're not denying you access, they're making it almost prohibitively costly to obtain that information. And so that is the approach that many governments are taking, because they simply don't want anybody looking at what they're doing. So just the investment in terms of resources, the people, the time, the documents, all of that is just is enormous. The end result is really important. Look, the reality is that if news organizations aren't holding their local officials or state officials or federal officials to account, often nobody is doing that. In fact, local prosecutors often get their best material from the work that their local newspaper has done.
Okay. We're going to open it up to questions from the audience. Is someone walking around with a microphone, or?
I'm going to be loud enough.
Say.
People probably ask you this question all the time. We have access to the story from which the movie Spotlight was made. How accurate is the movie versus the reality that you know?
It's pretty accurate. The writers, Tom McCarthy, who was also the director, and Josh Singer did an incredible amount of job. They wanted it to be as authentic as it possibly could. Josh has actually got a law degree at Harvard after getting an MBA at Harvard. Of course, what did he do? Become a screenwriter. So, so he spent a lot of time going through the documents. He interviewed us. He reviewed. Walter Robinson, who was the head of the Spotlight team, saved all his emails, and Josh went through all those emails and reconstructed dialogue from that. So the overall arc of the investigation is pretty faithfully portrayed. Of course, it's a movie, it's not a documentary. There has been a documentary made, but this is a movie, and it has to fit into 2 hours and keep your interest, by the way. So, and where there are no superheroes, where there's no romance, just the opposite, where there's none of that, and where the most exciting thing that people do is look through a bunch of church directories. So, there is some creative license in there, but fundamentally it's an accurate portrayal. So, for example, in terms of the launching of that investigation, I launched that on my first day at my first meeting because of a column that I read the day before I started work at the Boston Globe. And we went around the newsroom, asked people, what are, everybody's talking about what they're doing for the day. Nobody mentioned this case of a priest who had been accused of abusing as many as 80 kids, where the plaintiff's lawyer said the cardinal himself was aware of this abuse and yet continually reassign this priest from parish to parish, not telling anybody. And then the archdiocese flatly denied that. And at the end of the column, it was said, the truth may never be known because the documents are under court seal, and so the public can't know. And so I raised at that meeting, can't we get beyond one side? The problem in that instance was balance. You had one side saying one thing, the other side saying something else. But what we really needed to get at is, what's the truth here? So that's the question I asked. Can't we get beyond one side saying one thing and the other side saying something else? Can we find out what really happened here? Because if, in fact, the cardinal really knew about this, it's an incredible story. And I raised the question about whether we might go to court to unseal the documents. And then we had a conversation with our lawyer, whom I had never met before, and he started doing research, and ultimately we prevailed in court, and we did a parallel journalistic investigation.
First of all, thanks for sharing time with us tonight, and Autumn, thanks for your leadership. The news media, all the papers, all the TV pundits, the Atlantic magazine this week, are talking about the fear that if Trump is reelected, he plans to come after our free press. Is there any effort in this country now among leaders of the free press to anticipate this, and how would they try to prevent such a thing happening?
Well, first of all, clearly he intends to do that. He's been quite explicit about that and a bunch of other things that he plans to do if he finds himself back in the White House. So one of the things about Trump is that he often just tells you exactly what he plans to do, so we should take it seriously. And so one of those is to come after the press. His former aide, Kash Patel, said that they're going to come after the press with civil lawsuits and criminal prosecutions for what I would consider to be imaginary violations of the law. And so, you know, I don't know that there's any organized effort within the press to be able to counter this. It's very hard until there's actually some action taken. No doubt, if action were taken, there would be, I think that the media would coordinate and collaborate in supporting any institution that came under attack, whether it's journalists were being prosecuted or whether the institution itself were being prosecuted, filing amicus briefs and things of that sort. It's hard. You know, our rights are the same as yours. I mean, we have no more rights. As journalists, we don't have any more rights than any ordinary citizen. So a challenge to us in terms of our ability, our free expression, is a challenge to the free expression of every citizen. And so we don't have any special rights. So I'm sure that the media industry would work together to try to counter any efforts on the part of a second Trump administration. But you really have to wait to see what it is he intends to do. So the question was, what is the hardest story I've worked on, and what is my favorite story to work on? So the favorite story is definitely the Catholic Church investigation, and the reason is because it affected the lives of ordinary people. These were people, the survivors of abuse. Their voices simply hadn't been heard. They were people completely without power. They were treated as if they were crazy or inconsequential by law enforcement, by politicians, and by the press. And so I feel good that their voices were heard, that we finally brought accountability, and that it has had an enduring impact, not just on the Catholic Church, but on how other institutions deal with cases of abuse and that sort of thing, whether it's the Boy Scouts or whether it's you know, any Penn State or whatever it might be. There are any number of institutions that have faced these kinds of allegations, and the way they respond is different today than it was previously, and it continues to have consequences in countries throughout the world. So I'm very proud of that because it affected the lives of ordinary people whose voices desperately needed to be heard. In terms of the hardest story, the hardest stories are, it's kind of related, actually. It's the Me Too stories. Those are really difficult because typically in those Me Too stories, you have two people in a room, typically a man and a woman, and typically a woman who says that something terrible really happened, and then a man who says either nothing happened or it was consensual. and there are no eyewitnesses. And so figuring out what the threshold is for publication of allegations, you want to do justice to the woman who says she was wronged, but you also need to be fair to, and typically, the man who says that he was unfairly accused. And those are incredibly difficult stories. If you get it wrong, it's possible if you publish a story and you got it wrong, it's possible you've destroyed not only the career, but the entire life of the person who's been accused. And if you don't do a story, it's possible that you didn't provide justice to someone who deserved it. And making those decisions is agonizing and difficult, and we have, other things that we look at, like other evidence, like did somebody keep a diary, did somebody tell friends contemporaneously, things of that sort. Did they file a complaint of any sort? Is there a non-disclosure agreement? Whole range of things that we try to look for, but typically our standard was that at least one accuser needs to be identified. And in many instances, no single accuser is willing to identify herself. And so that creates a lot of tension in your newsrooms, and there's an enormous amount of risk attached to those stories for everybody involved, for the institution, the media institution, but also for the individuals who are the accused and the accuser. And I never experienced any more difficult stories than those stories. And I was criticized both for stories that we published and then for stories that we didn't publish. I came under withering criticism for both. And I talk about that in the book, about how I take people through those cases and explain why we decided to publish some and decided not to publish others, and one in particular. And then you can decide for yourself whether I made the right decisions or not. But they're really tough. They're really tough.
I think we're going to do one last question.
Okay. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm interested in your thoughts on the impact of artificial intelligence in the newspaper business, either good or bad influence with things like ChatGPT?
Well, it's going to have an enormous influence, I'm sure. And I actually do some advising for a company that aims to introduce generative artificial intelligence into newsrooms, but in a constructive way. And I have very great confidence in the values of these individuals who founded this company. So I think it can be helpful in some ways. Journalists experience they have to do a huge number of things now, from writing headlines that work really well on social media, headlines that work really well for search, like Google search, constant updates, alerts, all these sorts of things, finding their own photos to go with their stories, you name it, all while they're supposed to be reporting. This is all stuff that reporters didn't have to do before, a lot of extra tasks. And so generative AI can be really helpful in terms of time management, helping people find the information they're looking for, helping them in terms of updating their stories, but using the information that's within their own news organization rather than going out into the ether and trying to find things and then resulting in what are now called hallucinations, basically a lot of error-filled stories. I don't call them hallucinations, I call them fabrications, by the way, which is a more accurate description of what they are. So it's just fabrications produced by a machine, essentially. So in terms of, I think the greatest risk is going to be that, and I think we will probably see that in this presidential election, is that we are going to see a lot of videos and other visual images, still images that are completely false, that have been fabricated. We will hear audio recordings that are completely false. Generative AI now has the capacity to replicate your voice. It can hear you for a while, and then it can replicate it with other words. And so, those security measures that banks have, that you're just using your voice and they know that it's you, totally worthless today. I feel confident that we're going to see a lot of this, and it'll probably make its appearance in the last couple of months of the election. And people are going to believe it. It's going to be disseminated widely and instantaneously, and it's going to have huge consequences. It could potentially have huge consequences on the election.
The Post and Courier has been the recipient of numerous industry awards, including the 2015 Pulitzer Prize in Journalism for Public Service. I'm often asked, what makes the Post and Courier so special? The answer is easy. It's our leader. He truly believes in journalism, and he believes that newspapers are vital to our democracy. Chairman of the Board of Evening Post Publishing, Pierre Manigault, has worked in media and communications since 1987 for the National Geographic Society, the Washington Post, and the former Evening Post Industries newspaper and network television affiliates. In 2007, he co-founded Garden and Gun magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Pierre Manigault.
Thank you all so much for being here. This has become a wonderful annual event, at least in my book. I really love the format of it. I think it's a great opportunity for readers of the Post and Courier to get to know how the newspaper works and the people that are behind it, and it also gives the reporters and editors of the newspaper a chance to dialogue with our readers without, when they're not in an interview situation. I think I know most of you by now, or have met you, but a real quick, short background. I'm privileged and feel honored to be the fourth generation of my family to be involved with the Post and Courier. It's something I never thought I would go into. It was the family business, and I wasn't going to do that. I was working at National Geographic, and I was going to save the world by being a wildlife documentary filmmaker. So I worked up there for several years, and I came home for Christmas for a few days, 1 year, and an old alumnus of the Post and Courier, a guy named Doug Donahue, who was legendary that many of you may know or may not, he called me over to his house on Bull Street, and he sat me down, and he told me that enough of this nonsense working in television, you need to come home and work at the paper. And I said, yes, sir. But about that time, I was also realized I wasn't going to be able to save the world through National Geographic Television, but that maybe I could make a difference in Charleston, in the Low Country, in an area I cared about. I told my father, who had never pushed me into going into the family business, to his credit, told him I might be interested in coming home and working at the paper, and he said, son, that's wonderful, now go get some experience. So I trudged around the corner to the Washington Post, and they had an opening for copy aides, which means you deliver coffee, newspaper, and mail to reporters and editors. So I did that for about a year, and then was lucky enough to get some writing assignments on the business desk, and ultimately ended up working in the editorial department for then editor Meg Greenfield doing copy editing, and came home to Charleston and ended up working with Charles Rowe, who was here earlier, and for Barbara Williams' editorial department here at the Post and Courier, and learned a lot and really got into the culture of the newspaper of Charleston, learned a lot about the city that I'd grown up in, and learned how important the newspaper's role in the community was. And I don't think I ever really understood that until I don't think any of us do until we get to a certain age. But also to be a part of the newspaper and know what it was doing in the community and the difference it made in the community was life-changing for me, because it becomes bigger than a family company. It becomes bigger than a business. You realize that it is truly a part of the community. It's not part of the government, but it's every bit as important as the government because it's keeping an eye on the government. And it's a critically important piece of society. And as we all know, and as we've been reminded many times tonight, that is threatened, that is in danger in this country. And my job, I feel today, is to allow a world in this state where we can actually have a newspaper that can play the role that newspapers are meant to play traditionally in society. It's all about the journalism. It's all about the content. PJ and I know we all talk about this all the time. Content is king. It's all about the journalism. There is no business, there is no newspaper, particularly today, without great journalism, because you could throw anything out there on the street and advertisers would advertise in it and there was your money. But now that's not the case. We don't have the advertisers. The only way that the newspaper can survive is through the readers who believe in it and want it and need the information and want the information. So we have to provide that great journalism. It's taken us back to our roots, and that's a great thing. I was, I guess, unfortunate enough to take over as chairman of the board right about the time that the newspaper decline seriously began in 2008. So it's like, oh, well, this is great. Now, Pierre's run the paper into the ground. But I soon realized that this is probably the most exciting time to be in this business because it is more necessary now than it's arguably ever been. And though the threats are tremendous, the opportunity is also tremendous. The decline of newspapers throughout the state has been a terrible thing, but it's offered us some opportunity because we are able to spread across the state. And not only is that an opportunity for us, but I think it's an obligation that we must face. We are not just trying to save journalism in Charleston, we're trying to save journalism in South Carolina, in every small community throughout South Carolina. Yeah, we've expanded into the big markets, but the small markets that we deal with the Uncovered series, we're trying to raise journalism throughout the state and preserve journalism throughout the state. And hopefully, with this great model we've come up with, that PJ has come up with, PJ, looked at papers across the country for years and came up with the model of this community-supported, funded journalism. And you all have received it so well and embraced it, and that has made all the difference to us, to our newsroom, what we can do. And if this model can be used as a template across this country, it just takes one newspaper in every state to do it. If one newspaper in every state can do it, then we have a future. But journalism has to stay alive in this country, as you all know, and with your help, we are making that happen. And I really appreciate that so much. I appreciate all that you've done, all that you've given in the past. I encourage, excuse me, I'm in dry mouth. I encourage you to stay with us and continue. Your dollars go not to me. I don't get a salary. They don't come to me. We don't pay our shareholders dividends. We don't pay our board of directors. The money you give goes directly, every bit of it, to newsroom expenses associated with producing great journalism. Thank you for what you've done. Please stick with us. Bring in more people if you can. And thank you for everything, and thank you for coming tonight.